"Sir, you need to step away from the aircraft right now." The command cracked across the humid afternoon air like a warning shot, sharp and cold beneath the distant thunder of rotor blades somewhere beyond the mountains. Sergeant Cole Mercer stood at the edge of the restricted helipad with one hand resting near the strap of his rifle, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting the old man standing quietly beyond the painted yellow line. Around them, Fort Ashburn moved with the controlled violence of a classified military machine. Black SUVs rolled across the concrete. Fuel crews hurried beneath the spinning shadows of parked helicopters. The scent of jet fuel and hot steel drifted through the heat, haze rising off the tarmac. And in the center of it all stood Walter Hayes. He looked completely out of place. 80 years old, maybe more. Thin frame beneath a faded olive drab field jacket that had long since lost its color. Worn denim jeans. Dust-covered work boots. White hair moving gently in the rotor wash sweeping across the landing zone. He carried an old leather satchel at his side, the leather cracked with age and softened by decades of use. The old man said nothing. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on the sky instead of the armed operators surrounding him. That silence irritated Mercer more than open resistance would have. Delta operators were used to command presence. Civilians usually panicked the moment rifles appeared. This man didn't even blink. "You deaf?" Mercer snapped, stepping closer. "Restricted area means restricted. Turn around and head back to the visitor checkpoint before this becomes a problem." A few members of the assault team, standing near the armored vehicles, smirked quietly. One of them, Staff Sergeant Nolan Pierce, folded his arms across his chest and shook his head. "Probably another old contractor who wandered into the wrong side of the base," he muttered. "Happens every month." The laughter that followed was low and casual, but Walter Hayes never reacted to it. His eyes drifted upward again. A distant helicopter passed somewhere behind the clouds, invisible except for the faint rhythmic chopping echoing through the valley. Walter tilted his head slightly, listening. Not casually, intently, like a man hearing something nobody else noticed. Mercer watched him with growing impatience. "Sir," he said again, slower this time, "I'm giving you one final warning." The old man finally spoke. His voice was rough, low, worn smooth by time. "That rotor's out of sync." Mercer frowned. "What?" Walter's gaze never left the sky. Port side vibrations off by half a degree. For a second, nobody spoke. Then Pierce let out a laugh. "You hear that?" he called toward the others. "Grandpa thinks he's flight control." More chuckles spread through the operators gathered near the helipad. One of the younger men slapped the side of a nearby fuel cart and grinned. "Maybe we should get him a headset and a tower badge." Mercer smirked despite himself, but something about the old man's expression unsettled him. Walter Hayes wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't joking. He simply stood there beneath the burning afternoon sun with the calm stillness of someone who had spent a lifetime around machines that flew men into places most people prayed never existed. The distant helicopter sound faded into silence. Walter slowly lowered his eyes toward the row of matte black MH-47 Chinooks parked near the hangars. His gaze moved across them carefully, almost affectionately, like he recognized them. Like he remembered another lifetime hidden somewhere beneath the fresh paint and classified markings. Mercer stepped forward again, irritation sharpening his tone. "That's enough. Turn around and move." Walter finally looked at him directly. The old man's eyes were clear, steady, unsettlingly calm. "You boys should ground Echo 3, he said quietly. "Hydraulic bleed valves failing." Pierce barked another laugh. "This just keeps getting better." But before Mercer could answer, a sudden burst of static exploded across the nearby radio channel. Then somewhere across the flight line, an alarm began to scream. The screaming alarm rolled across the flight line with mechanical urgency, sharp enough to cut through every conversation on the tarmac. Red warning lights suddenly ignited along the side of Hangar 3, bathing the concrete in flashes of crimson. The laughter around Walter Hayes died instantly. Sergeant Cole Mercer turned toward the nearest Chinook just as ground crews erupted into motion. Men who had been casually standing beside maintenance carts seconds earlier were now sprinting across the hot pavement. One crew chief grabbed a headset with trembling hands while another pointed frantically toward the rear rotor housing of Echo 3. "Hydraulic pressure drop," someone shouted across the radio traffic. Abort startup sequence immediately. Mercer's smirk vanished. The heavy afternoon heat suddenly felt tighter around his neck. He looked back at Walter. The old man had not moved an inch. His weathered face remained calm beneath the pulsing emergency lights, pale blue eyes fixed on the helicopter as if none of this surprised him. Nearby, Staff Sergeant Nolan Pierce forced out an uneasy chuckle. "Lucky guess," he muttered, though there was no confidence left in his voice now. Walter slowly shook his head. "No such thing," he said quietly. The Chinook's massive rotors slowed overhead with a deep metallic groan, each rotation chopping through the thick summer air above Fort Ashburn. Fuel vapors drifted across the landing zone, while warning sirens continued echoing between the concrete hangars lining the base perimeter. Mercer stared at the old man more carefully now. The faded field jacket, the scarred leather satchel hanging at his side. The stillness. It was not the stillness of confusion. It was experience. The kind built over decades around machines capable of carrying men into storms most people only saw in movies. Captain Ryan Voss emerged from the operations building moments later, moving fast with the hard stride of someone already angry before he arrived. Tall, sharp-featured, late 30s, every inch of him radiated command authority. The black Delta Force patch on his sleeve caught the flashing emergency lights as he approached the group. "What is happening?" Voss demanded. Mercer straightened immediately. "Mechanical issue on Echo 3, sir. Maintenance crews shut her down." Voss glanced toward the grounded helicopter, then toward Walter. "And who exactly is this?" Before Mercer could answer, Pierce spoke up. "Some old civilian hanging around the restricted pad. Claims he knew the helicopter had a problem before the alarm triggered." Voss looked Walter up and down once, dismissively. "Contractor. No identification so far," Mercer answered. "Refuses to leave." Walter met Voss's gaze without the slightest trace of intimidation. The captain folded his arms. "You realize wandering onto a Delta operations pad is not a misunderstanding, old man." Walter's eyes drifted briefly toward the helicopters again. "You should inspect the second bird too," he said calmly. "Fuel regulator sounds uneven." Pierce let out a disbelieving breath. "You have got to be kidding me." But nobody laughed this time. The atmosphere had changed. Operators nearby kept stealing glances toward Walter now, the way soldiers glance at something they cannot explain but no longer want to mock openly. Voss stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Listen carefully. I do not know who you think you are, but this base does not run on ghost stories and lucky guesses. You are leaving. Right now." Walter looked past him toward the mountain ridgeline beyond the wire fence. The afternoon sun hung low there, burning orange through the dust haze swirling across the valley. For a moment, his expression shifted. Not fear, not anger, something older, like a man hearing echoes nobody else could hear anymore. Then his eyes settled quietly back on Voss. "This place used to sound different," Walter murmured. Voss frowned. "What?" The old man's gaze drifted toward the Chinooks again. "Back then," he said softly, "the rotor blades were louder than the fear." A strange silence settled over the group. Even Mercer felt it now. Something heavy beneath the surface. Something none of them understood yet. Then one of the younger operators near the maintenance crews bent down beside Walter's worn leather satchel. "What is in this thing anyway?" the operator muttered before grabbing the strap and yanking the old bag off Walter's shoulder. The leather strap slipped from Walter Hayes's shoulder and hit the concrete with a dull crack that somehow sounded louder than the warning alarms still echoing. Across the flight line, the younger Delta operator grinned as the old satchel tumbled sideways onto the hot pavement. "Let us see what kind of treasure the old-timer is carrying around," he said. A few nearby operators smirked uneasily, but nobody stepped forward to stop him. Captain Ryan Voss remained still with his arms crossed while the afternoon wind pushed waves of rotor wash across the tarmac. Slowly, several objects spilled from the satchel. An old flashlight scratched nearly silver with age. A pair of worn leather gloves darkened by oil stains. A folded map sealed inside faded plastic. And finally, a heavy steel wrench rolled across the concrete before stopping near Sergeant Cole Mercer's boots. The tool looked ancient. Thick. Solid. The steel was scarred with small dents and scratches carved deep over decades of use. Near the handle, faded black letters had been engraved by hand. Pierce bent down, picked it up, and laughed quietly. "What is this thing?" he asked. "A museum piece?" Walter's eyes settled on the wrench instantly. Something shifted behind them. Not anger. Something deeper. Older. Pierce turned the wrench in his hands mockingly. You planning to fix helicopters with this antique? The operators around him chuckled softly again, though the confidence from earlier was gone now. The screaming alarms in the background had changed the atmosphere. Nobody felt completely comfortable anymore. Walter took a slow breath as the warm wind moved through his silver hair. That tool kept men alive, he said quietly. Pierce smirked. Sure it did. He flipped the wrench once in his palm carelessly. The moment the steel caught the afternoon sunlight, Walter's expression changed. The modern base around him dissolved beneath the weight of memory. The clean concrete flight line vanished. Suddenly, there was rain. Endless rain hammering against jungle leaves beneath a black sky. The deep thunder of helicopter rotors echoed through wet mountains somewhere far from home. Walter was 23 again, soaked to the bone beneath the violent pulse of spinning blades. The Huey's engine screamed overhead, while terrified young soldiers crowded inside the shaking aircraft. Mud covered everything. Rotor wash blasted water through the trees. A frightened crew chief shouted over the roar of the storm, while tracer fire burned red across the darkness below. And there, balanced dangerously against the open side of the helicopter, young Walter Hayes drove that same steel wrench into a shattered hydraulic fitting with bloody, shaking hands while the aircraft fought to stay airborne above the jungle canopy. Come on, someone had screamed through the headset. Come on, Raven Actual. Walter remembered the smell most of all. Wet canvas, burned aviation fuel, hot steel, fear. He remembered a wounded pilot gripping his shoulder with trembling fingers while rainwater streamed down both their faces. If this bird drops, the pilot whispered, we all disappear out here. The memory hit like distant thunder and vanished just as quickly. Walter blinked once. The jungle disappeared. Fort Ashburn returned around him in waves of flashing red emergency lights and swirling dust. Pierce still held the wrench casually in one hand, completely unaware of what that piece of steel carried inside it. Walter stepped forward slowly. Give me the wrench, he said. For the first time since the confrontation began, his voice carried weight sharp enough to silence everyone nearby. Pierce hesitated before handing it back. The old man took the wrench carefully, almost respectfully, then slid it back into the satchel with steady hands. Mercer watched him closely now. Every instinct told him this was no confused civilian. There was something buried beneath the silence surrounding Walter Hayes. Something dangerous not in violence, but in history. Nearby, maintenance crews suddenly erupted into another wave of shouting. One of the Chinook mechanics sprinted across the tarmac toward Captain Voss, holding a headset against his ear. His face had gone pale beneath the afternoon sun. Captain, the mechanic called breathlessly. Echo 2 just failed diagnostics too. The operators exchanged uneasy looks immediately. Voss frowned hard. What failed? The mechanic swallowed. Fuel regulator imbalance. A cold silence rolled across the helipad. Slowly, every eye turned back toward Walter Hayes. The silence that settled over the helipad felt heavier than the screaming alarms ever had. Hot wind swept across the tarmac, carrying the sharp smell of aviation fuel and burned hydraulic fluid, while every pair of eyes remained fixed on Walter Hayes. The old man stood quietly beside his worn leather satchel, one hand resting lightly against the cracked strap as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Captain Ryan Voss stared at him for several long seconds before finally turning toward the mechanic. Run the diagnostics again, he ordered sharply. Now. We already did twice, the mechanic answered nervously. Fuel regulator imbalance exactly where he said it would be. Nobody laughed this time. Sergeant Cole Mercer felt the tension spreading through the operators around him. These were Delta men. They trusted precision, systems, training, experience. Not old men standing alone near restricted flight lines predicting mechanical failures before computers detected them. Yet that was exactly what had just happened. Twice. Nearby, one of the grounded Chinooks groaned softly in the wind, its giant rotors rocking with slow metallic creaks beneath the darkening afternoon sky. Walter looked toward the aircraft again with the distant focus of someone reading a language nobody else understood anymore. You should not keep cycling the startup sequence, he said calmly. You are putting stress on the actuator housing. Voss narrowed his eyes. How exactly would you know that? Walter shrugged faintly. Because she is talking to you. Pierce muttered under his breath. This guy is insane. But Mercer noticed something important. Walter never sounded proud when he spoke. Never dramatic. He talked about helicopters the same way old sailors talked about storms or tides. Quietly. Respectfully. Like they were alive in ways most people forgot. One of the younger operators suddenly crouched near Walter's satchel again. "Captain," he said, pulling something halfway from the outer pocket. "You might want to see this." Voss stepped closer while the operator held up a faded cloth patch between two fingers. Time had nearly destroyed it. The edges were frayed. The stitching was sun-bleached and worn thin. But the symbol at the center still remained visible beneath years of fading. A black raven spread across a dark circle with a single silver stripe beneath it. Mercer frowned immediately. "What unit is that?" Nobody answered. Pierce squinted at the patch. "Looks homemade." Walter's face changed the instant he saw it in another man's hand. Not anger. Pain. Quiet and deep. "Put that back," he said softly. The operator hesitated. "Why?" Walter took a slow breath as warm rotor wash swept across the landing zone again. "Because the men who wore that patch never came home." The words landed heavily in the silence surrounding the group. Even Pierce stopped smirking. Somewhere in the distance, another helicopter engine started across the far side of the base, the deep turbine whine echoing beneath the mountains surrounding Fort Ashburn. Captain Voss reached for the patch carefully now, studying it more closely beneath the flashing red emergency lights. His expression hardened slightly. "I have never seen this insignia before." Walter nodded once. "You were not supposed to." Mercer felt a strange coldness crawl up the back of his neck. The old man's voice carried no arrogance. No attempt to sound mysterious. That was what unsettled him most. Walter Hayes spoke like someone remembering ghosts instead of telling stories. Voss handed the patch back without another word. Then he turned toward Mercer. "Escort him off the base," he ordered firmly. "I am done playing games." Mercer nodded automatically, though something inside him resisted the order now. Before he could move, another voice suddenly cut across the flight line. "Captain." Everyone turned. Chief Warrant Officer Ethan Blake stood near the maintenance crews holding a rugged military tablet in one hand. His expression had gone strangely pale beneath the fading sunlight. Blake walked toward them slowly, eyes locked on the old patch Walter had just placed back into the satchel. "Sir," Blake said carefully, "where exactly did you get that insignia?" Walter looked at him for the first time. Truly looked at him. Then the old man answered quietly. "Long time ago." Blake swallowed hard. His eyes never left the raven patch. "No," he said softly, almost to himself. "That cannot be possible." Chief Warrant Officer Ethan Blake stopped 3 feet from Walter Hayes, his rugged tablet hanging forgotten at his side, while the hot evening wind swept dust across the landing zone. The flashing emergency lights reflected faintly in his eyes now, but something else lived there too. Recognition. The kind that unsettled, trained men more than fear ever could. Captain Ryan Voss noticed it immediately. "What are you talking about, Chief?" Blake did not answer right away. His attention remained locked on the faded raven patch, disappearing slowly back into Walter's satchel. Around them, maintenance crews continued moving around the grounded Chinooks, but even their voices sounded quieter now beneath the growing tension on the flight line. Blake swallowed once. "I saw that insignia before," he said finally. "Years ago." Pierce folded his arms. "What is it? Some old special operations unit?" Blake shook his head slowly. "No official records. No public designation. Nothing in standard archives." He looked at Walter again. Only buried references inside classified aviation support files from Vietnam. Mercer frowned. "You are saying this old man belonged to some secret unit?" Walter answered before Blake could. Belonged is a strong word. His voice carried the strange calmness that had unsettled everyone since the moment he arrived. Blake took another careful step forward. "The Raven teams were never supposed to exist," he said quietly. The words seemed to pull the heat straight out of the evening air. Nearby rotor blades creaked softly in the wind, while the orange sun sank lower behind the mountains surrounding Fort Ashburn. Walter said nothing, but his eyes drifted away from the flight line now, somewhere far beyond the base, beyond the present. And suddenly the years peeled away from him again. The hot American air vanished beneath a wall of tropical rain hammering against jungle canopy. Rotor blades thundered overhead through black storm clouds, while green tracer fire ripped silently across distant mountainsides. Walter was young again, exhausted, soaked with rainwater and engine oil beneath the violent pulse of a damaged helicopter barely staying airborne above the jungle. The aircraft shook so hard the metal floor rattled beneath his knees. Warning lights burned red inside the dark cabin, while frightened soldiers clung to webbing straps along the walls. Somebody was praying over the radio. Somebody else was screaming coordinates through static. Young Walter Hayes ignored all of it. His hands moved with calm precision beneath the open maintenance panel, while hot hydraulic fluid soaked through his sleeves. Every movement mattered. Every second mattered. The pilot's strained voice crackled through the headset. "Raven Actual, we are losing pressure." Walter tightened the steel wrench one final time as rain blasted sideways through the open cabin door. "You are good," he answered. "Keep her level." Then came the sound he remembered most. Not fear. Not gunfire. Rotor blades catching stable rhythm again. The helicopter rising steadily through storm clouds instead of falling into darkness below. Relief flooding through terrified men too exhausted to speak. Someone in the cockpit whispered softly through static. "How the hell did you do that?" Young Walter never answered. He only stared through the rain toward the endless black jungle waiting beneath them. The memory vanished like smoke. Fort Ashburn returned around him beneath pulsing emergency lights and cooling evening air. Walter blinked slowly. Nearby, Blake still stared at him with growing disbelief. "No," Blake whispered quietly. "It cannot be." Captain Voss stepped closer, frustration tightening his jaw. "Chief, either explain yourself or stand down." Blake looked toward him carefully now. "Sir, Raven teams were attached to classified extraction missions during Vietnam. Aviation recovery. Emergency insertions. Combat retrieval operations." Pierce scoffed uneasily. "And?" Blake's voice lowered further. "According to the archived reports, most of them disappeared in 1972. Mercer glanced toward Walter instinctively. The old man remained silent beside his satchel while the wind stirred the edges of his faded field jacket. Blake looked directly at him now. One pilot survived long enough to write a final debrief before he died. The warrant officer paused. He mentioned a crew chief who kept damaged helicopters flying when they should have fallen out of the sky. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Blake's expression tightened. The crew chief's call sign was Raven Actual. The words hung over the flight line like thunder trapped beneath low clouds. Raven Actual. Even the mechanics working around the grounded Chinooks seemed quieter now, their movements slower beneath the flashing emergency lights. Sergeant Cole Mercer looked back at Walter Hayes with growing disbelief. The old man stood motionless beside his weathered satchel while warm evening wind tugged softly at his faded field jacket. He did not look legendary. He looked tired, like somebody who had spent an entire lifetime trying not to be remembered. Captain Ryan Voss finally broke the silence. "Chief," he said sharply, "you are telling me this man was part of some classified aviation program 50 years ago?" Ethan Blake nodded once, though his expression remained unsettled. "Not a program, sir. A recovery unit attached to operations that officially never happened." Pierce scoffed nervously. "And somehow this old guy is the last surviving ghost from Vietnam?" Walter answered quietly before Blake could speak again. "Not the last." His eyes drifted toward the darkening sky above the mountains. "Just the one who kept breathing." Mercer felt something cold settle into his stomach at the way he said it. No drama, no pride, just fact. Nearby, one of the mechanics hurried toward Captain Voss carrying a tablet full of diagnostics reports. "Sir," he said breathlessly, "maintenance just confirmed both aircraft failures originated from the same pressure imbalance." Exactly where he predicted. Voss rubbed a hand across his jaw, visibly irritated now by a situation slipping outside his control. "I do not care if he guessed right twice," he snapped. "This is still a restricted Delta installation." Walter looked toward the grounded Chinooks again. "Your crews are rushing," he said calmly. "That is when helicopters start burying people." The statement hit harder than anybody expected. The noise across the flight line seemed to fade for a moment beneath the weight inside those words. Blake studied Walter carefully now. "How many flights did you make?" he asked softly. Walter's expression barely changed. "Too many." "How many men did you pull out?" Walter looked down at his hands for a long moment before answering. "Enough that I still hear rotor blades in my sleep." The evening air thickened with silence again. Mercer noticed something then. Walter never once called himself a hero. Never once tried to impress anyone. Every answer sounded like a burden instead of a story. Blake suddenly turned and walked several steps away from the group, pulling his military tablet closer as he searched through secure archives with growing urgency. The glow from the screen reflected across his tense face, while lines of classified records scrolled rapidly beneath his fingertips. Then Blake stopped moving completely. His eyes widened. "No," he whispered. Captain Voss frowned immediately. "What now?" Blake looked up slowly from the tablet. "Sir, there is a classified personnel file attached to the Raven Operations Archive." He swallowed once. "Access level requires general officer authorization." Pierce forced out a laugh that sounded weaker than before. "You are kidding." Blake ignored him completely. His eyes remained fixed on Walter. "Status listed for Raven Actual is not retired." Mercer frowned. "Then what is it?" Blake hesitated. The hot wind swept dust across the tarmac, while warning lights flashed against the grounded helicopters behind them. Finally, Blake answered quietly. "Missing in action." Nobody spoke. Pierce blinked hard. "That makes no sense." "It gets worse," Blake murmured. He turned the tablet slightly toward Captain Voss. "The file has not been accessed in 23 years. Voss grabbed the device impatiently, scanning the screen beneath the pulsing red emergency lights. Then his expression changed for the first time since this started. The confidence faded from his face in small but visible cracks. Mercer stepped closer instinctively. "Sir." Voss did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the classified file. Then slowly, very slowly, he looked back toward Walter Hayes standing alone beside the satchel and the faded Raven patch. The old man met his stare calmly. No fear, no anger. Just the exhausted stillness of somebody who had carried forgotten years alone for far too long. Then suddenly a new sound rolled across Fort Ashburn. Deep, heavy, rhythmic. Rotor blades. Not one helicopter. Multiple. Every head on the flight line turned instinctively toward the darkening western sky. The sound rolled across the mountains like distant thunder, closing fast. Deep rotor blades beating against the evening sky with heavy military rhythm. Every man on the flight line looked west instinctively as dark shapes emerged above the ridgeline one by one. 3 helicopters. Blacked out. Flying low and tight against the fading sunset. Sergeant Cole Mercer felt the hairs rise along the back of his neck immediately. Those were not standard transport birds. Even from a distance, their movement carried a different kind of authority. Controlled. Precise. The kind of flight pattern that made entire bases stop and pay attention without anybody saying a word. Around the grounded Chinooks, mechanics froze mid-motion. Fuel crews stepped away from carts. Operators turned toward the approaching aircraft in complete silence, while the growing roar of rotors swallowed the entire flight line beneath it. Captain Ryan Voss narrowed his eyes toward the sky. "Who authorized inbound traffic?" he demanded sharply. Nobody answered. Ethan Blake stared at the incoming helicopters with visible disbelief. Then suddenly his military tablet chirped with a secure encrypted notification. The sharp electronic tone sounded tiny beneath the roaring rotors overhead, yet Blake reacted like somebody had been shocked. He looked down at the screen. His face lost all color. "Sir," he said quietly. Voss turned toward him impatiently. "What?" Blake swallowed hard before answering. Base Command just elevated the incoming flight clearance to Priority Black. Mercer frowned immediately. Priority Black? Even Pierce looked uneasy now. Nobody used that designation casually. Not on domestic soil. Not without senior command involvement far above normal operational authority. The helicopters descended lower, their rotor wash slamming across the tarmac hard enough to whip dust and loose papers into violent spirals across the landing zone. Red warning lights flashed against matte black fuselages as the aircraft approached with terrifying precision. Walter Hayes never moved. The old man stood calmly beside his satchel while the wind hammered his faded field jacket against his thin frame. His pale blue eyes followed the helicopters quietly. Not with surprise. Recognition. Mercer noticed it instantly. Walter knew who was coming. Captain Voss stepped closer to Blake. "Who is on those aircraft?" Blake stared at the secure notification for another second before answering carefully. "No manifest attached." "That is impossible." "There is one line." Blake looked up slowly. "Secure retrieval authorization." Pierce let out a nervous breath. Retrieval for who? Nobody answered because everybody already knew. The first helicopter descended toward the adjacent landing pad with violent force, rotor wash roaring across the base like a desert storm. Delta operators shielded their eyes while dust exploded outward beneath the aircraft. The second helicopter circled overhead. The third remained higher above the valley, silhouetted against the burning orange horizon like a watchful predator. Mercer glanced back toward Walter again. The old man looked smaller now beneath the storm of dust and flashing lights. Older, tired, but somehow more dangerous than before. Not dangerous like a weapon. Dangerous like history returning where it had been forgotten. Ethan Blake stepped toward Walter slowly. "Sir," he said carefully, almost respectfully now. "Who exactly are you?" Walter's eyes remained fixed on the descending helicopter. Nobody important anymore. Blake shook his head immediately. "That is not true." Walter gave the faintest smile then. "Sad. Distant. The men who mattered stayed overseas." The helicopter touched down with a thunderous blast of rotor wash that shook the entire landing zone. Massive black wheels slammed onto concrete while the turbine engines screamed against the darkening evening sky. Operators instinctively stepped backward. Even Captain Voss remained silent now. Slowly, the side door of the helicopter slid open. Bright interior lights cut through the swirling dust. A tall figure appeared inside wearing a dark service uniform beneath a flight jacket. Silver stars gleamed faintly against his collar in the flashing emergency lights. Mercer's stomach tightened instantly. Captain Voss straightened unconsciously. Ethan Blake looked like he had stopped breathing altogether. Because stepping down onto the tarmac through the swirling storm of rotor wash was Lieutenant General Nathan Crow. The moment Lieutenant General Nathan Crow stepped onto the tarmac, the entire atmosphere of Fort Ashburn changed. Rotor wash hammered across the landing zone in violent waves, flattening dust against the concrete, while the massive helicopter behind him thundered beneath the darkening sky. The silver stars on Crow's collar caught the flashing emergency lights as he walked forward with long, deliberate strides through the storm of wind and noise. Nobody moved. Delta operators who had faced combat zones without blinking now stood frozen beside grounded helicopters and maintenance carts, watching one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States military cross the flight line personally. Captain Ryan Voss snapped to attention automatically. Sergeant Cole Mercer followed half a second later. Around them, mechanics and operators straightened instinctively beneath the deafening pulse of rotor blades overhead. But General Crow ignored all of them. His eyes locked onto Walter Hayes the instant he stepped away from the helicopter. Ethan Blake felt his chest tighten. He had expected recognition. Maybe questions. What he saw instead looked closer to shock. Real shock. The kind powerful men rarely allowed themselves to show. Walter stood motionless beneath the swirling dust, one hand resting lightly on the old leather satchel, while his faded field jacket snapped violently in the wind. The old man looked impossibly small compared to the machinery and armed operators surrounding him. Yet somehow the entire base now felt centered around him. General Crow stopped 10 feet away. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The only sound came from roaring turbine engines and rotor blades cutting through the evening air. Then Crow took one slow step closer. His face had gone pale beneath the flashing lights. "Walter," he said quietly. Nobody on the flight line had expected the general's voice to sound like that. Not authority. Not command. Relief. Walter's tired eyes lifted toward him. "Nathan." Captain Voss blinked hard in disbelief. Mercer exchanged stunned looks with Pierce. Nobody addressed generals by first name. Nobody. Yet Crow did not react with anger. If anything, the sound of his own name seemed to hit him harder than anything else that had happened. The general studied Walter carefully, as if confirming the old man standing before him was real. "We searched for you," Crow said softly. Walter gave a faint, tired smile. Not hard enough. The words carried no bitterness. That somehow made them heavier. Rotor wash continued ripping across the tarmac, while the second helicopter circled slowly above the valley like a silent guardian. Around the flight line, operators stared openly now. Ethan Blake watched General Crow's expression shift beneath the emergency lights. Not respect alone. Guilt. Deep and old. Crow stepped even closer toward Walter. "They told us your helicopter went down north of the border," he said quietly. Walter looked past him toward the dark mountains beyond Fort Ashburn. It did. Silence settled heavily between them. Then General Crow noticed the faded raven patch partially visible near the satchel. His eyes locked onto it instantly. For a brief second, the hardened military composure vanished from his face completely. Mercer saw it clearly. Emotion, raw and immediate. Crow reached toward the patch slowly, but stopped himself before touching it. "I never thought I would see that insignia again," he whispered. Walter's expression remained calm. "Most of the men wearing it are still out there." The words hit like cold iron. Nearby, even Pierce lowered his eyes. Nobody joked anymore. Nobody smirked. The arrogance from earlier had vanished beneath something far heavier. General Crow turned suddenly toward Captain Voss and the Delta operators surrounding the flight line. His voice changed instantly. Hard. Sharp. Command authority returning like a drawn blade. "Who ordered this man removed from the base?" Nobody answered right away. Captain Voss stepped forward carefully. "Sir, we did not know who he was." Crow stared at him for several long seconds while the helicopter engines screamed behind them. Then the general looked back toward Walter Hayes standing alone beneath the storm of rotor wash and flashing red lights. His jaw tightened visibly. "That," General Crow said quietly, "is exactly the problem." The wind across Fort Ashburn began to settle as the helicopters idled on the flight line, their massive rotors still turning beneath the dark blue evening sky. Dust slowly drifted back to the concrete, while the flashing emergency lights painted long red reflections across the grounded Chinooks. Nobody spoke. The entire base seemed caught inside the silence surrounding Walter Hayes and Lieutenant General Nathan Crow. Captain Ryan Voss stood rigid beside his operators, but the confidence from earlier was gone completely now. Sergeant Cole Mercer could barely look at the old man anymore without feeling a knot tighten in his chest. Just an hour earlier, they had treated him like a confused trespasser, a nuisance, an old civilian standing too close to restricted aircraft. Now one of the highest-ranking generals in the country stood before him like a man facing a ghost from another lifetime. General Crow slowly removed his gloves, his eyes never leaving Walter. "You should have contacted somebody," he said quietly. Walter gave the faintest shrug. "For what?" Crow looked around the flight line. The helicopters. The operators, the grounded aircraft, the armed men standing silent beneath the glow of emergency lights. "Because there are still people who remember what you did." Walter's expression softened slightly at that. "That is the problem with memories," he murmured. "The good ones leave first." The words settled heavily over everyone listening. Ethan Blake lowered his eyes. Even Pierce looked ashamed now, standing near the maintenance carts with his arms hanging uselessly at his sides. General Crow reached into his jacket slowly and removed a small folded cloth package. He held it carefully for a moment before offering it toward Walter with both hands. Walter stared at it quietly. Then he unfolded the cloth. Inside rested a weathered silver insignia shaped like a raven with spread wings. The metal was scratched and darkened with age, but still unmistakable. Walter's fingers stopped moving the instant he saw it. For the first time all evening, emotion cracked through the old man's calm expression. Not dramatic, not loud, just pain carried too long. "We found it in the wreckage," Crow said softly. "I kept it all these years." Walter ran his thumb slowly across the old insignia while rotor blades thundered softly overhead. His eyes drifted toward the mountains beyond the base again. Somewhere far away, somewhere filled with rain and jungle shadows and helicopters fighting to stay airborne in the dark. "Tommy wore this one," Walter whispered. Crow nodded once. "He made sure we got out." Neither man spoke for several seconds after that. They did not need to. Some memories were too heavy for words. Around them, Delta operators remained perfectly still. Mercer realized then that none of them had truly understood what military service meant until this moment. Not medals, not rank, not power. Sacrifice carried silently for decades without asking for recognition. General Crow suddenly straightened and stepped back half a pace. Then, beneath the spinning rotors and flashing emergency lights, he raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute toward Walter Hayes. Every person on the flight line froze. Walter looked stunned for only a fraction of a second before he quietly returned the salute. The old mechanic, the forgotten crew chief, the man listed as missing for more than 50 years. One by one, the Delta operators followed the general's example. Mercer came to attention first, then Voss, then Pierce, then every mechanic, crew chief, and operator standing across the tarmac beneath the darkening sky. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The only sound came from the steady rhythm of helicopter blades turning overhead like echoes from another era refusing to die. Walter lowered his hand slowly. His tired eyes moved across the young soldiers standing before him now. Men who had mocked him only an hour ago. Men who now looked at him with something entirely different. Respect. Real respect. Walter picked up the old leather satchel beside his feet and glanced once more toward the grounded Chinooks. Your crews should replace the actuator seals before morning, he said quietly, or those birds are not flying anywhere. A few mechanics nodded immediately. General Crow allowed himself the smallest smile. Then the old man turned toward the waiting helicopter as the wind swept softly across the flight line. Mercer watched him walk away beneath the spinning rotors, smaller with every step, until the darkness and dust slowly swallowed him from view. And long after the helicopters disappeared into the night sky above Fort Ashburn, nobody on that base ever laughed at a quiet old veteran again.